let's look into one of the specific block that we generally use in exception handling, that is your finally block. So the finally block is mainly used for cleaning up operations, and it usually guarantee the execution of a certain code no matter what happens during the execution of the try block. Now, so it is coming along with yours try and accept, and the very important part is like it is always going to execute whether an exception is raised or there is no exception, and whether the exception is handled or it is not being handled. So this particular block which I'm going to attach along with your try and accept, it is always going to execute, and it does not depend upon whether there is an exception or there is not an exception, whether this except block is able to handle the exception or not. And very usually we sometimes require certain resources to be released, and certain files might be getting to be closed, and in those cases we want this particular code to execute under any circumstances, and that is why we take the help of a finally block. So mostly the finally block is going to improve the program reliability and safety, and the very common uses are nothing but you're closing up the files which you have opened in the try block, releasing some database connections, closing some network sockets, and maybe freeing some locked resources. Now let's look into various scenario. The case 1. So in this particular piece of code, we have a try block where there is only one statement like print try. So we understand there is no exception out of this. Okay, though we have written except block, this will not execute. Okay, because we have no exception in this particular try block. But even if there is no exception, this finally block is going to execute. So as a result, you can see the output here. We are getting this try printed, which is a part of your try block. And because there is no exception, so there is no role of this entire portion. But this finally block will definitely execute where I am trying to print finally. So the output is try and finally. Now case 2, we have an exception raised, but it is handled. So like you can see inside this try block, we have a message that is your try, and this print 10 by 0. So this obviously going to be an exception, and because there is an exception raised, so it is going to bring the control to this except block, and because this class is matching with this kind of exception, hence this except will be printed. And now even though this exception has raised and handled, still there is no impact on the finally block. So finally block is also going to execute. So as a result, in the output we can see try is printed. Because of this, the control has come to the except block where I'm able to print this except, and then at the end we are getting the finally also printed. Now let's look into case number 3 where the exception is raised but it is not handled. So the same piece of code here, like we have written try and I'm trying to print 10 by 0. Now we see the except block which has a class called name error, and because we understand this is a 0 division error, so this except block is unable to handle it. So as a result of which, okay, so the exception is raised but the exception is not handled. Even though this is the scenario, this finally block is definitely going to execute. Like you can see try we have got, and finally is also there. Because the exception could not be handled properly, so we are getting this error message or exception message 0 division error followed by the description. So these are the 3 different scenario we have seen where irrespective of whatever the scenario is, like there is no exception, exception raised but handled, exception raised but not handled, all the 3 cases we can see the finally block will definitely execute. But there is one specific situation when finally block will not execute. If we are calling this exit function, in fact underscore exit function of OS module, you suppose inside this try block or in exit block somewhere we are calling this exit function, then the control will never goes to the finally block. It is going to terminate there itself, because this exit function usually terminates the program then and there itself. So in this particular context, the finally block will never be executed.